My husband stood by my bed for weeks, whispering prayers into the hospital air while I lay unresponsive. The day I finally opened my eyes, I spoke fluent Portuguese, a language I'd never learned, and called him by another name. When the doctors left us alone, I gripped his wrist and whispered, "Why does my heart recognize his face instead of yours?" That's when I knew the marriage certificate hanging in our hallway held secrets darker than my coma ever could. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Elara Morgan. I'm 34, a former linguistics professor at Waverly University in Connecticut, and according to my medical chart, I'd been in a coma for 47 days after a car accident on Route 15. My husband, Dean, had barely left my side. According to the nurses, the devoted spouse keeping vigil while the doctors offered increasingly pessimistic timelines for my recovery. The first thing I remember after waking was the ceiling, sterile white panels with fluorescent lights that buzzed like trapped insects. My throat felt like sandpaper. My limbs weighed down as though gravity had doubled overnight. I tried to lift my hand, and the movement felt foreign, like I was piloting someone else's body through sheer force of will. A nurse noticed first. Her clipboard clattered to the floor as she rushed to my side, her voice calling down the hallway for the doctor. I remember trying to speak, to ask what had happened, but what came out wasn't English. "Onde estou? Okay? Aconteceu?" The words tumbled from my lips effortlessly. The nurse froze, her eyes widening. "Dr. Winters, she's awake and speaking." "I think it's Spanish?" "Portuguese," I corrected automatically, though I had no idea how I knew that. I'd never studied Portuguese, never even visited Brazil or Portugal. French was my specialty. I'd spent years researching linguistic patterns in Quebec. Dean rushed in moments later, his face unshaven, eyes rimmed with shadows. He looked thinner than I remembered, more fragile somehow. When he saw me, tears immediately welled in his eyes. "Elara? Oh my God, you're awake." He reached for my hand, and I felt myself flinch involuntarily. "Quem é você?" I asked, then immediately felt confused by my own words. Dean's face fell. "Honey, it's me. It's Dean, your husband." Something felt wrong. Looking at his face was like staring at a photograph that had been slightly altered, familiar but fundamentally incorrect. I knew intellectually that this was Dean Morgan, the man I'd married 4 years ago after meeting at a faculty mixer. But emotionally, my heart registered nothing but a vague discomfort. The doctors called it foreign language syndrome, a rare manifestation of brain trauma where patients wake speaking a language they've never formally learned. They explained it as neural pathways rerouting, accessing dormant linguistic information that had been passively absorbed throughout my life. But that didn't explain why I couldn't seem to access English for the first 3 days, or why when I looked at my husband, I saw a stranger. My room filled with specialists, neurologists, linguists, psychologists. They ran tests, asked questions, documented my responses. Some I answered in broken English as it slowly returned. Others still flowed out in fluent Portuguese. The content of what I was saying seemed less important to them than the phenomenon itself. I became a medical curiosity, my brain a puzzle. They were eager to solve. Dean stayed through it all, his patience unwavering. He showed me photos from our wedding, our honeymoon in Maine, the house we'd purchased in the suburbs 2 years ago. I nodded along, trying to match the images to memories that felt increasingly like they belonged to someone else. "Do you remember the day we met?" he asked quietly one evening after the last doctor had left. I searched my mind, found fragments. "The university reception. You were wearing a blue tie." His face brightened. "That's right. You spilled champagne on my shoes." But the memory felt hollow, like I was reciting facts from a biography rather than my own life. And underneath it all was something else, a face I couldn't quite place, a name that danced at the edge of my consciousness. Ricardo. Who was Ricardo? On the 5th day, they moved me to a regular room. Dean brought clothes from home, soft sweatpants, a Yale t-shirt I apparently loved, fuzzy socks with cats on them. None of it felt like mine, though I recognized them from the dresser I could picture in our bedroom. That night, after Dean had gone home to shower and change, I had my first clear dream since waking. I was standing on a balcony overlooking the ocean, warm air thick with salt and jasmine. A man's arms wrapped around me from behind, and though I couldn't see his face, I knew it was Ricardo. I felt safe. I felt home. I woke up gasping, tears streaming down my face, gripping the hospital sheets like a lifeline. When Dean returned the next morning, I studied his face more carefully. Objectively, he was handsome. Sandy brown hair, kind eyes, the type of smile that crinkled at the corners. But it didn't stir anything in me. Not recognition, not love, not even the mild irritation couples often feel after years together. Just nothing. A blank space where emotion should be. "They're discharging you tomorrow," he said, setting a duffel bag on the chair. "I've taken 2 weeks off work to help you settle in." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The thought of going home with this man who felt like a stranger sent a chill through me. But what choice did I have? According to every document, every photo, every person who knew us, I was Elara Morgan, wife of Dean Morgan, resident of 47 Oakwood Lane. "There's something wrong," I said finally, the words feeling thick in my mouth. "With me, with my memories." Dean sat on the edge of the bed, careful not to jostle me. "The doctors said that's normal after trauma. Your memories will come back, in time." I shook my head. "It's not that I don't remember. It's that what I remember feels wrong." I couldn't bring myself to mention Ricardo, the dreams, the sense that I was living someone else's life. He squeezed my hand. "We'll figure it out together, one day at a time." The drive home the next day was surreal. Connecticut in autumn should have felt familiar. The maple trees blazing red and orange, the historic colonial houses lining winding roads. But it all seemed like a movie set, meticulously designed but fundamentally unreal. Our house, allegedly our house, was a charming 2-story colonial with dark green shutters and a red door. Inside, everything was exactly as the photos had shown. Family pictures lined the staircase. Our wedding, holidays with his parents, a hiking trip in Vermont. My diplomas hung in the study. Books in French and English filled the shelves. Everything in its proper place, telling the story of Elara and Dean Morgan. Yet as I moved through the rooms, I felt like an archaeologist excavating someone else's life. In the master bathroom, I opened drawers finding toiletries I didn't recognize as mine. In the closet, clothes that matched my size, but not what I felt was my style. Everything was just slightly off, like trying to write with your non-dominant hand. Dean watched me carefully, trying not to hover but clearly concerned. "Hungry? I could make that pasta you like." I nodded, not having the heart to tell him I had no idea what pasta I supposedly liked. While he cooked, I wandered into the study and sat at the desk, presumably my desk. The computer was password protected, but I instinctively typed Belvedere 19, and it unlocked. How did I know that when so much else was blank? I opened the browser history, hoping for clues to the person I'd been. Mostly academic journals, news sites, and Netflix. Nothing revelatory. I checked email next, work correspondence, Amazon confirmations, book club reminders, the mundane details of a life I couldn't feel. Then I noticed a folder on the desktop labeled simply Research. Inside were dozens of files, notes on bilingualism, language acquisition, brain plasticity, and buried among them, a subfolder titled São Paulo Project. My heart raced as I clicked it open. Inside were photos of a coastal town, interview, transcripts in Portuguese and English, audio files. According to the notes, I'd spent 3 months in Brazil 2 years ago, researching linguistic drift in immigrant communities. A research trip I had no memory of, yet somehow explained my Portuguese. But something about the notes felt personal, almost intimate. The way certain passages were highlighted, the margin notes that seemed more diary than academic observation. "Dinner's ready," Dean called from the kitchen. I quickly closed the folder and followed his voice. The pasta was penne with vodka sauce. I took a bite and was surprised by how familiar it tasted. A small victory. "Good?" he asked hopefully. "Yes," I said, and meant it. "Very good." That night, lying beside Dean in our bed, careful inches of space between us, I stared at the ceiling fan rotating slowly above. He'd been nothing but patient, kind, understanding. So why did sharing a room with him feel like an invasion? "Dean?" I whispered, uncertain if he was still awake. "Hmm?" He turned toward me, eyes half open. Was I happy? Before the accident? The question hung in the air between us. He propped himself up on one elbow. "I thought so," he said finally. "We were talking about starting a family. You'd just received tenure. Things were good." He paused. "Weren't they?" I couldn't answer. Instead, I asked, "Tell me about the accident." He sighed, lying back down. "You were driving back from the university. It was raining. They think you swerved to avoid something on the road and hit the guardrail. Your car flipped down an embankment." His voice tightened. "When they called me, they weren't sure you'd make it through the night." I tried to remember any of it, the rain, the swerve, the impact, but there was nothing. Just a blank space between sitting in my office grading papers and waking up speaking Portuguese. "What was I working on? At the university?" "Your book," he said. "On linguistic anomalies in trauma patients." He gave a humorless laugh. "Ironic, right?" "Indeed." I turned away, feigning sleepiness, but my mind raced. Tomorrow, I decided, I needed to visit my office at the university. Perhaps there, among my academic life, I'd find answers that this domestic setting couldn't provide. The next morning, I convinced Dean I needed to check my campus mailbox and pick up some research materials. He seemed relieved that I was showing interest in my work, even offered to drive me. I insisted on going alone, needing space to think without his worried gaze following my every move. Waverly University was exactly as the photos showed. Gothic architecture, ivy-covered walls, students crossing the quad with coffee and backpacks. My office was in the linguistics department, 3rd floor of Hammond Hall. I found it easily, as if my feet remembered the path even if my mind didn't. Professor E. Morgan read the nameplate. I used the key from my bag, surprised again by these automatic actions that felt both foreign and instinctive. Inside, books lined the walls. Papers were stacked neatly on the desk. A small couch sat beneath. The window, a throw blanket folded over one arm. It looked lived in, comfortable. More like home than the house I'd slept in last night. I sat at the desk, running my fingers over the smooth wood. This felt right somehow. I opened drawers, looking for anything that might spark genuine memory. In the bottom drawer, beneath a stack of academic journals, I found a leather-bound journal. My handwriting filled the pages. Notes, reflections, personal thoughts. I flipped to the entries from 2 years ago, around the time of the Brazil research trip. April 17th, 2023. São Paulo is everything I imagined and nothing I expected. The language is music here. different from the Portuguese I studied. Ricardo says I'm picking it up remarkably fast. He's been an invaluable guide through both the city and its linguistic landscape. Ricardo, the name from my dreams, written in my own hand. I flipped forward. May 9th, 2023. Spent the day interviewing families in the coastal district. Ricardo translated when my Portuguese failed me, though that's happening less often. There's something about the way he speaks, passionate about language preservation, about cultural identity. His perspective has completely reshaped my research. Focus June 1st, 2023. Last night changed everything. The connection between us isn't just intellectual anymore. I don't know what happens when I return to Connecticut, to Dean. How can I go back to a life that suddenly feels like it belongs to someone else? My hands trembled as I read the words. An affair. I'd had an affair in Brazil with a man named Ricardo. A man who now haunted my dreams, whose face felt more familiar than my husband's. But that didn't explain the coma, the language, the lingering sense that something fundamental was wrong with my life. I continued reading, hoping for clarity. June 20th, 2023. Back home. Dean suspects nothing. Thinks my distraction is just post-research adjustment. How can I live like this? Every night I dream of São Paulo, of Ricardo. Every morning I wake up feeling like I'm in the wrong life. August 4th, 2023. Ricardo called. Today. He's coming to a linguistics conference in Boston next month. Says he needs to see me. I told him it's impossible, that I've made my choice to stay with Dean. The lie tasted bitter. September 15th, 2023. Met R in Boston. 3 hours in a hotel room that felt more honest than the 4 years I've spent in my marriage. He asked me to leave with him, to come back to Brazil. Said life is too short for compromises that hollow you out. I didn't say no. The entries continued, documenting a year of internal conflict, clandestine meetings, promises made and broken. The last entry was dated just 2 days before my accident, March 3rd, 2024. I've made my decision. Told R I'll meet him tomorrow. There's a direct flight from Hartford to São Paulo at 8 p.m. Dean will be at his conference in Chicago. By the time he returns, I'll be gone. Left a letter explaining everything in my desk at home. Can't face telling. Him in person. Cowardly, perhaps, but kinder than the truth spoken aloud. I sat back, heart pounding. I was leaving. I was leaving Dean for Ricardo the day of my accident, but I never made it to the airport. Instead, I ended up unconscious in a hospital bed, and when I woke up, I was speaking the language of the country I had planned to escape to. I searched the office frantically for any photos, any contact information for Ricardo. Nothing. It was as if he existed only in my journal and my fractured memories. My phone buzzed with a text from Dean. Everything okay? Need me to pick you up? I texted back quickly. All good. Taking longer than expected. Home in a few hours. I needed to think. If I was planning to leave, there would be evidence. Passport ready, perhaps luggage packed and hidden, bank accounts adjusted. And the letter, the confession I'd supposedly left in my desk at home. But I'd been through that desk yesterday and found nothing resembling a goodbye letter. I locked the office and walked across campus to the linguistics department's main office. The secretary looked up as I entered, her face lighting with surprise. Professor Morgan! We didn't expect you back so soon. She hurried around the desk to hug me. How are you feeling? Still adjusting, I said honestly. Actually, I'm trying to piece together some things from before the accident. Do you remember if I mentioned a research contact from Brazil? Ricardo something? Her brow furrowed. Ricardo? No, I don't think so. But you were pretty private about your São Paulo project. Said you were taking it in a new direction that you weren't ready to share yet. I nodded, disappointed but not surprised. And my schedule the day of the accident? Was there anything unusual? She pulled up the department calendar on her computer. You had office hours until 2, then you canceled your afternoon seminar, said you weren't feeling well. She looked up. That wasn't like you canceling last minute. Because I was preparing to leave the country, I thought but didn't say. Thanks, Martha. That helps. Back in my car, I sat with the journal in my lap, trying to reconcile these written words with the life I'd woken up to. If I was so unhappy, so ready to leave Dean for Ricardo, why couldn't I feel any of that now? And where was the letter I'd supposedly written? I drove home slowly, my mind racing faster than the car ever could. Dean's car wasn't in the driveway. When I arrived, probably running errands to give me space, always considerate even when I couldn't reciprocate his feelings. I went straight to the study and began a methodical search of every drawer, shelf, and hiding place. No letter, no passport either, which seemed odd if I'd been planning international travel. My laptop revealed little, the browser history from the days before the accident had been cleared, and my email showed no correspondence with anyone named Ricardo. It was as if someone had systematically erased all evidence of my planned departure. But who? And why? I sat at the desk, running my fingers along the edges, looking for hidden compartments, anything that might hold answers. As I leaned back, in frustration, I noticed something odd about the bookshelf behind me. A framed photo of Dean and me at his parents' anniversary party hung slightly askew. Behind it was a small safe built into the wall, the kind meant for valuables or important documents. My fingers hovered over the keypad. What would the combination be? I tried our anniversary. Nothing. Dean's birthday. Nothing. My birthday. Still. Nothing. Then on instinct, I typed 0617 June 17th, the date from my journal when things had changed everything with Ricardo. The safe clicked open. Inside was a single envelope, unsealed. I withdrew it with trembling hands and unfolded the letter inside. Dean, by the time you read this, I'll be gone. Not just from our home, but from the country. I've tried to make this work, to be the wife you deserve. But I've been living a lie for over a year now. In Brazil, I met someone who helped me see that the life we've built together isn't the one I'm meant to live. I didn't plan for this to happen. I didn't go looking for anything beyond my research. But sometimes life shows you a door you didn't know existed, and once you've seen it, you can never unsee it. I'm not taking much, just enough clothes for a fresh start. I've left my share of our accounts untouched. The house is yours, along with everything in it. These things were never really mine anyway, just props in a life I was performing rather than living. I'm sorry for the pain this will cause. I'm sorry I couldn't be honest sooner. Most of all, I'm sorry I couldn't love you the way you loved me. Elara. I stared at the letter, written in my handwriting but feeling like it belonged to someone else. This was the confession I'd planned to leave, the clean break before starting a new life. But here it was, still in the safe, undelivered. And something else caught my attention, a small notation at the bottom of the page, also in my handwriting but added later, with different ink. Flight canceled due to weather. Rescheduled for 3/5. Will leave letter Wednesday morning. I never left. The flight was canceled, rescheduled for 2 days later, and in between, the accident happened. I never made it to Ricardo, never delivered the letter, never escaped the life that now felt both familiar and foreign. I carefully returned everything. To the safe, closed it, and rehung the photo. Dean would be home soon, and I needed time to process what I'd discovered. The journal entries, the letter, the plans for escape, they all belonged to a version of me that no longer existed. The accident had wiped away not just my memories, but my desires, my emotional connections, my sense of self. As I stood in the bar, middle of the study, surrounded by the trappings of a life I'd been ready to abandon, a strange calm settled over me. Perhaps this was a second chance, not just at my marriage, but at truly choosing my path rather than being swept along by passion or obligation. I heard the front door open, Dean's footsteps in the hallway. Elara? I picked up dinner from that Thai place you like. Another piece of a life I couldn't remember loving or hating. I took a deep breath and stepped out of the study to greet my husband. This man who loved a woman who had ceased to exist the moment my head hit the steering wheel on a rainy Connecticut evening. That sounds perfect, I said, smiling. Actually, there's something I wanted to talk to you about. That night at the dining table, the Thai food sat untouched between us. Dean's face had gone through a remarkable transformation as I spoke. Confusion, then disbelief, followed by a pallor that made the veins in his temples visible beneath his skin. I showed him the journal, explained about Ricardo, the flight that never happened, the letter still hidden in our safe. You were going to leave? His voice sounded hollow, like it was coming from the bottom of an empty well. Without even talking. To me first? I spread my hands helplessly. The person I was, apparently thought it would be kinder this way. Dean pushed back from the table, his chair scraping against the hardwood floor. He walked to the window, staring out at the darkening street. His shoulders rose and fell with each careful breath. The strangest part, I continued, is that I don't feel any of it now. Ricardo is just a name, a face in dreams. And you? I hesitated, knowing the next words might hurt him more than the revelation of my planned betrayal. You're familiar but not connected. It's like I'm looking at our life through glass. He turned back to me, eyes glistening. Do you want to leave now? Is that what this conversation is about? No, I said firmly. I'm trying to understand who I was, who I am now. The accident changed something fundamental in me. The woman who wrote that letter isn't the woman sitting here now. Dean returned to the table but didn't sit. Instead, he braced his hands on the back of his chair, knuckles white. Did you ever love me? Before Brazil? Before Ricardo? The question struck me like a physical blow. I searched my fractured memories, trying to find the truth. I think I must have. We built this life together. That doesn't happen without love. But you don't remember loving me. It wasn't a question. I don't remember much of anything with real feeling attached, I admitted. It's like watching someone else's home movies. I recognize the scenes but can't feel what the people in them felt. Dean finally sank back into his chair. So where does that leave us? I reached across the table and took his hand. It felt strange, not repulsive, just unfamiliar. I don't know, but I think I owe it to both of us to find out, to see if the person I am now can build something real with you. His fingers tightened around mine. And if you can't? I met his eyes directly. Then we'll face that honestly. No more hidden letters, no secrets. Whatever happens, happens in the open. We ate in silence after that, the food long cold, but neither of us caring. That night, Dean slept in the guest room without me having to ask. Some boundaries didn't need to be articulated. The next morning, I woke to the smell of coffee and the sound of quiet conversation downstairs. I pulled on a robe and followed the voices to the kitchen, where I found Dean talking with a woman I didn't recognize. They both looked up when I entered. Elara, Dean said, his voice carefully neutral. You remember Dr. Winters? The woman smiled kindly. She was in her 50s with silver-streaked dark hair pulled into a neat bun. We met at the hospital, but you might not recall. I'm your neurologist. I nodded cautiously. Why are you here? I asked her to come, Dean said. After our conversation last night, I thought, we could use some professional guidance. Dr. Winters gestured to the coffee pot. May I? I nodded, and she poured herself a cup before sitting at the island. Dean tells me you've been experiencing some significant emotional disconnection, along with the foreign language phenomenon we observed in the hospital. That's one way to put it, I said, pouring my own coffee. I have the facts of my life, but none of the feelings that should accompany them. She nodded thoughtfully. In rare cases of traumatic brain injury, we see what's called dissociative amnesia with identity disturbance. Your case is particularly unusual because of the language component, but the emotional detachment is actually more common than you might think. So this has happened to others? I asked, feeling a strange relief that I wasn't alone. Similar scenarios, yes, usually temporary, though the timeline for recovery varies widely. She sipped her coffee. I'd like to run some additional tests, if you're willing. Perhaps a functional MRI to see which areas of your brain are activating when you access different types of memories. I glanced at Dean, who was watching me with barely concealed hope. He wanted the doctors to fix me, to bring back the Elara, who, despite her plans to leave him, at least felt something for him. All right, I agreed. When? I've cleared my schedule this morning, Dr. Winters said. We could go now, if you're up for it. 2 hours later, I lay inside the massive MRI machine, trying to remain perfectly still as it clattered and hummed around me. Through a microphone, Dr. Winters guided me through a series of memory exercises. Think about your wedding day. Try to visualize the details. I closed my eyes, summoning the images I'd seen in our photo albums. White dress, garden ceremony, Dean's parents crying in the front row. But it was like recalling a movie scene, visually clear but emotionally flat. Now think about your time in Brazil, specifically any memories associated with Ricardo. Something shifted. The memories were hazier, less complete, but carried an emotional weight the others lacked. Warm evening air, the sound of waves, a laugh that made my chest tighten even now. These weren't memories from photographs. They were embodied. Sensory recollections. After the scan, Dr. Winters showed us the results on her office computer. Colorful images of my brain lit up in different patterns as she pointed to specific regions. This is fascinating, she said, clinical interest overriding bedside manner. When accessing memories from before Brazil, childhood, college, early marriage, your limbic system shows minimal activity. But with the Brazil memories, particularly those involving this Ricardo person, we see significant engagement of the amygdala and hippocampus, the emotional centers of the brain. What does that mean? Dean asked, his voice tight. Dr. Winters leaned back in her chair. It suggests that Elara's brain injury has affected how she processes emotional memories from before a certain point. The newer memories, specifically those with high emotional content from Brazil, appear to have been stored differently or protected somehow during the trauma. So I can feel emotions connected to Ricardo, but not to my own husband? I said, incredulously. It's not that simple, she cautioned. Your brain is still healing. These patterns may shift over time. But yes, currently your emotional access seems limited to more recent, highly charged experiences. Dean stood abruptly. I need some air. He left the office without looking back. Dr. Winters watched him go with sympathy. This is difficult. For both of you, in different ways. I nodded, suddenly exhausted. Can it be fixed? Can I get those emotional connections back? The brain has remarkable plasticity, she said. I've seen patients recover connections we thought were permanently severed. But I won't offer false hope. Some changes may be permanent. The question becomes not whether you can go back to who you were, but whether you can build something meaningful from who you are now. Her words stayed with me as I drove home alone. Dean had taken an Uber, needing space. The autumn trees blazed against a perfect blue sky, a beauty I could appreciate intellectually, but couldn't quite feel. I found myself driving past our neighborhood, taking unfamiliar turns until I reached the university campus again. This time, I went not to my office but to the International Studies Department. A hunch, perhaps, or some half-remembered detail from my journal. The department secretary looked up in surprise when I entered. "Professor Morgan, we heard about your accident. So glad to see you recovering." "Thanks," I said, offering a polite smile. "I'm actually trying to track down a visiting scholar who was here last fall. Brazilian linguist named Ricardo. I've lost his contact information." She frowned, typing something into her computer. "We had several visiting scholars from South America last year, but I don't recall a Ricardo. Let me check our records." After several minutes of searching, she looked up apologetically. "No Ricardo listed. We had a Roberto Santiago from Chile and a Rafael Mendez from Argentina, but no Brazilian linguists named Ricardo." I thanked her and left, confusion mounting. If Ricardo had come for a conference as my journal indicated, there should be records. Unless we'd met elsewhere, or unless I'd been deliberately vague in my journal to cover my tracks. Back in my car, I pulled out my phone and opened my email, searching for any mention of Ricardo or Brazil. Nothing. Next, I checked my text messages, scrolling back through months of conversations. Dean, colleagues, my sister in Oregon, but no international numbers, no one named Ricardo. It was as if he'd been systematically erased from my digital life. Or, a more disturbing thought, as if he'd never existed at all. I drove home in a daze, pulling into our driveway just as dusk was settling over the neighborhood. Dean's car was there, the lights inside glowing warmly against the gathering darkness. I sat in my car for a long moment, gathering courage for whatever came next. Inside, Dean was cooking. The smell of garlic and rosemary filled the kitchen. He glanced up when I entered but continued chopping vegetables with precise, measured movements. "Dr. Winters called," he said without preamble. "She wants you to start cognitive rehabilitation therapy next week. 3 sessions to start, then they'll reassess." I nodded, leaning against the counter. "Dean, I need to ask you something, and I need the absolute truth." He set down the knife, wiped his hands on a towel. "Okay. Did I ever mention someone named Ricardo to you? Anyone from Brazil who was important to me?" His expression shifted, subtly, a tightening around the eyes, a slight compression of his lips. "Why do you ask?" "Because I can't find any evidence he existed outside my journal. No emails, no texts, no university records of a visiting scholar." Dean turned back to the cutting board, resuming his chopping with more force than necessary. "You never mentioned him by name. Just that you'd met someone during your research who'd given you a new perspective on your work. I assumed it was professional. But you knew it wasn't," I pressed. "You suspected." He slammed the knife down. "What do you want me to say, Elara? That I knew my wife was having an affair? That I could see it in your eyes every time you checked your phone? That I heard you whispering in Portuguese in the bathroom when you thought I was asleep?" His outburst hung in the air between us. I took a step back, startled by the raw pain in his voice. "I didn't know details," he continued more quietly. "I didn't want to know. I thought if I just loved you enough, if I pretended everything was normal, you'd come back to me. Choose me." "But I didn't," I said softly. "I chose him." Dean's shoulders slumped. "You were going to. But then the accident happened and suddenly you were back. Physically, at least." He looked up, his eyes glistening. "Do you know what it's like to have your wife look at you like a stranger, but to still hope that's better than her not being here at all?" I moved toward him cautiously, placed a hand on his arm. "I'm trying to understand, Dean, all of it. Who I was, what happened, what I felt. But I can't do that if pieces are missing." He nodded slowly. "After your accident, while you were unconscious, I went through your phone. I found the messages. I deleted them." "You what?" I pulled my hand away. "I was hurt and angry and terrified of losing you," he said, his voice breaking. "I thought if you woke up, maybe without those reminders, we'd have a chance. I didn't expect you to wake up speaking his language, dreaming about him. I didn't expect the universe to have such a cruel sense of irony." I backed away, trying to process this new information. "What else did you erase? What else did you hide? From me?" "Nothing important," he insisted. "Just the texts, some emails. I couldn't access your university accounts. The rest was already gone. You'd been careful." "And the letter? Did you find that before or after the accident?" He looked. "Way. After. When I was looking for your insurance information. I put it in the safe because I couldn't bear to destroy it. But I couldn't bear to read it again either." I felt dizzy suddenly, gripping the counter for support. "So you've been manipulating my reality since I woke up, letting me think I was crazy for having these disconnected feelings, these dreams about someone who supposedly left no trace. I was trying to protect what we had." Dean's voice rose again. "I thought if you didn't remember him, we could start over. The doctors said your memory might never fully return. I saw it as a second chance." "A second chance built on lies," I said bitterly. "Did it ever occur to you that these missing pieces might be important for my recovery? That I'm struggling to reconcile who I am now because parts of my past have been deliberately hidden from me?" Dean sank into a chair, burying his face in his hands. "I'm sorry. I was desperate. I've been living with a ghost since your accident. Not just Ricardo's, but the ghost of who we were before Brazil. I just wanted my wife back." I stood there, watching this man who loved a version of me that no longer existed, who had tried to reshape my reality to fit his needs. Anger rose in me, the first emotion I'd felt with real clarity since waking. But beneath it was something else. Understanding, perhaps. The recognition that desperation can make people do things they'd never otherwise consider. "I need to find him," I said finally. "Ricardo. I need to know if what I felt was real or just some fantasy I constructed to escape my life here." Dean looked up, despair etched into every line of his face. "And if you find him? If those feelings come rushing back?" "Then I'll deal with that honestly," I said. "But I can't keep living in this half-life, Dean. I need all the pieces of my past to figure out my future." He nodded slowly, resignation replacing despair. "I saved one thing. I couldn't bring myself to delete it." He pulled out his phone, navigated to a hidden folder, and handed it to me. "It's a voicemail, from the day before your accident." I took the phone with trembling hands and pressed play. A man's voice filled the kitchen, speaking in accented English. "Elara, it's me. Flight's confirmed for tomorrow night. I'll be waiting at Guarulhos just like we planned. One bag, like you said. A new start." A pause, then softly. "Te amo. Até amanhã. I love you. Until tomorrow." The voice triggered something. Not quite. A memory, but a feeling. Warmth, certainty, longing. I closed my eyes, letting the sensation wash over me. "There's a number," Dean said quietly. I never blocked it. I kept thinking you might remember, might try to contact him, and then I'd know for sure it was over between us. I handed the phone back without looking at the number. "Thank you for showing me this, for being honest, finally." He nodded, eyes downcast. "What now?" I took a deep breath, feeling more centered than I had since waking in that hospital. Now I need to make a call, and then we both need to decide what we really want, not what we think we should want, not what we think the other person needs. Just truth." Dean stood, wiping his hands on his jeans. "I'll give you some privacy. Take all the time you need." As he moved toward the door, I caught his arm. "Dean, thank you. For being there when I woke up. For not giving up. Even when it was hard. Whatever happens next, I won't forget that." A sad smile crossed his face. "That's something, I suppose." Then he was gone, footsteps retreating up the stairs, leaving me alone in the kitchen with a decision that would reshape all our lives. I sat at the table staring at my phone. Ricardo's number was in Dean's phone, just a few steps away. One call could answer so many questions. But something held me back. Not fear, exactly, but caution. I wasn't the same woman who had planned to run away with a Brazilian linguist. My brain had literally been rewired. What if I called and felt nothing? What if I called and it overwhelmed me, pulled me back into a decision made by someone I no longer was? I opened my journal instead, reading my own words again. The progression was clear. Initial professional admiration evolving into intellectual connection, then emotional entanglement, then physical passion. A classic affair narrative, yet it had felt transformative to the woman who wrote those entries. Had it been real love, or just an escape hatch from a marriage that had grown too comfortable, too predictable? Outside, the streetlights flickered, on, casting long shadows across the kitchen floor. I made my decision. Not out of fear or obligation, but from the one place of clarity I'd found since waking, the need for complete truth, however painful. I climbed the stairs slowly, each step feeling like a choice in itself. Dean was sitting on the edge of our bed, staring at a framed photo of us from years ago, taken on a beach in Maine. He looked up as I entered, his expression guarded but open. "I'm not going to call him," I said. "Not yet." Surprise flickered across his face. "Why not?" I sat beside him, careful to maintain a small distance between us. "Because I need to know who I am now before I can make any decisions about who I want to be with." The woman who wrote that journal, who left that letter, she made her choice from a complete understanding of her own heart. I don't have that yet. Dean set the photo down gently. "And how do you plan to find it?" "By starting over," I said simply, not pretending the past didn't happen, but not letting it dictate my future either. "I want to get to know you again, Dean. And I want to get to know myself. This new self with a rewired brain and a heart that's still figuring out what it wants." He studied my face, looking for deception or uncertainty. Finding none, he nodded slowly. "What does that look like, practically speaking?" "Honesty, space, patience." I counted them off on my fingers. No more deleted messages or hidden truths. No pressure to feel things I don't feel yet. And time. Time to rebuild neural pathways, to create new memories, to see if what we had can be reconstructed, or if something different might grow in its place. "And Ricardo?" he asked, the name clearly difficult for him to say. "Remains. A question I'll answer when I'm ready," I said firmly. "Not out of spite or to keep you guessing, but because I genuinely don't know what I want regarding him. The connection is there in my brain scans, but I need to understand if it's real or just neural wiring preserved through trauma." Dean took a deep breath, released it slowly. "Okay, we start over. No expectations, no pressure. Just two people figuring out if they have a future together." I offered my hand, and he took it hesitantly. "My name is Elara Morgan," I said with a small smile. "I used to be a linguistics professor. Now I'm just trying to find my way back to myself." A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "Dean Morgan. I teach comparative literature and make a decent risotto, currently helping my wife navigate the strangest chapter of our lives." We sat there, hands clasped loosely, the evening light casting long shadows across the bedroom floor. Not quite strangers, not quite partners, but something in between. Two people standing at a crossroads, finally seeing all paths clearly. The next morning, I woke before dawn, the bedroom bathed in the blue-gray light of early morning. Dean had slept in the guest room again, a boundary we'd established as part of our starting over agreement. I laid in bed for a moment, cataloging my feelings. The anger from yesterday had faded, replaced by something like resolve. Today marked 1 week since I'd woken up speaking Portuguese. 1 week of navigating this strange new existence. I padded, downstairs in bare feet, making coffee in the quiet kitchen. Through the window, I could see our backyard, a Japanese maple just beginning to turn crimson, a small herb garden near the fence, a wooden bench beneath an arbor. Had I chosen these things? Had I sat on that bench with a book on summer evenings? My therapist, Dr. Abernathy, whom I'd met yesterday after my session with Dr. Winters, had suggested I create new memories deliberately to rebuild my connection to my environment. Think of it as constructing a bridge from who you are now to the life around you, she'd said. With that in mind, I took my coffee outside, wrapping myself in a cardigan against the autumn chill. The bench was cool beneath me, slightly damp, with morning dew. I ran my fingers over the smooth wood, noticing small imperfections, a knot in the grain, initials carved discreetly in one corner, DM plus EM, Dean and Elara Morgan. A small act of sentimentality that struck me as both touching and foreign. Had I watched him carve these? Had I protested or encouraged it? Morning! Dean's voice came from the back door. He stood there holding his own coffee mug, hesitant. Mind if I join you? I gestured to the space beside me. It's your bench, too. He sat, leaving a careful few inches between us. First time? You've sat out here since the accident. I'm trying to create new connections, I explained. Dr. Abernathy's suggestion. He nodded, blowing across his coffee. I built this bench, our second anniversary. You'd been talking about wanting a reading nook in the garden. I studied the bench with new interest. You made this? It's beautiful work. I was better with my hands back then, he said, with a self-deprecating smile. Before academia claimed all my time. Tell me about that, I said, turning slightly to face him. How we met. The real version, not the photo album highlights. Dean's expression softened with memory. Faculty, orientation at Waverly. You were 3 years into your tenure track, already making waves in the linguistics department. I was the nervous new hire in comparative literature. You were wearing this green dress that matched your eyes, and when they asked us to pair up, for some ridiculous team-building exercise, you picked me. Why? I asked, genuinely curious. I asked you that, months later. You said it was because I was the only one who didn't look like I was trying too hard to seem smart. He chuckled. Academic egos were on full display that day. I smiled, trying to picture the scene. And then? Coffee after the orientation. You talked about language acquisition patterns. I talked about symbolic resonance in translation. Complete academic gibberish to most people, but we kept finishing each other's sentences. His eyes grew distant with memory. You invited me to a department mixer the following week. I spent 3 days deciding what to wear. The image was charming. This confident man beside me fretting over clothing choices like a teenager. Fast forward to the proposal? Dean's smile faltered slightly. That wasn't as romantic as you might hope. We'd been dating about a year. We were at a conference in Montreal. You were presenting on bilingual cognition patterns. There was a terrible snowstorm. Our flight got canceled, and we ended up stranded in this tiny hotel for 2 extra days. Sounds romantic to me, I offered. It wasn't, he laughed. The heating was spotty. We were living on vending machine snacks, and we both had piles of ungraded midterms. We were sitting on the bed surrounded by papers, both grading, neither of us had showered that day, and suddenly I just looked at you and thought, this is it. This is what I want forever. The messy, imperfect, real thing. So you proposed surrounded by student essays? With a paperclip, he confirmed. Bent it into a circle, went down on one knee right there on the hotel carpet. Promised to get you a real ring when we got home. I glanced at my left hand, where a simple emerald sat in a gold band. This one? He nodded. You said you didn't want a diamond. That emeralds reminded you of growth, of living things. That sounded right. Somehow. A choice that resonated with who I felt I was even now. Thank you, I said softly, for telling me that story. The real version. That's what we promised, right? Honesty. We sat in comfortable silence for a few minutes, watching the garden slowly brighten with daylight. Birds hopped along the fence, pecking at the ground for breakfast. I have cognitive therapy at 10, I said eventually. But after that, I'd like to go back to the university. Would you come with me? Show me our old haunts. Help me see it through your eyes? The surprise on his face quickly gave way to pleasure. I'd like that. 2 hours later, after a session with Dr. Abernathy that left me mentally exhausted but clearer, Dean and I walked across the Waverly campus. The quad was busy with students rushing between classes, lounging on blankets, enjoying the mild weather, tossing frisbees despite signs prohibiting it. This is where we'd meet for lunch on Tuesdays and Thursdays, Dean said, pointing to a shaded bench near the old library. Our schedules overlapped, and it was halfway between our buildings. We continued walking, Dean occasionally pointing out landmarks of our shared history. The coffee shop where we'd grade papers on Sunday afternoons. The auditorium where I'd given a lecture that he said had made him fall in love with my mind. All over again. The oak tree where we'd shared our first kiss after a faculty reception. It felt like a guided tour of someone else's romance. But I found myself watching Dean more than the locations he indicated. The way his face lit up with certain memories. The gestures he used when excited. The sound of his laugh when recalling something particularly amusing. I was studying him, this man who knew me so well, looking for clues to who we had been together. And this, he said, stopping outside a small Italian restaurant just off campus, is where we had dinner the night. You got back from Brazil. The first time. My attention sharpened. The first research trip? Before Ricardo? He nodded, his enthusiasm dimming slightly. You were different when you came back. Distracted. I thought it was just post-research adjustment, like your journal, said. But looking back, maybe that's when things started to change. I studied the restaurant, warm lighting visible through the windows, white tablecloths, a chalkboard outside listing specials in flowery script. Were we happy that night? Dean considered this, his brow furrowing with the effort of honest recollection. Parts of it. You were excited about your research, animated when talking about the linguistic patterns you'd discovered. But there was a distance, too. You wouldn't quite meet my eyes when I asked about the people you'd met. Let's go in, I said suddenly. Now? It's barely 4 o'clock. Just for a drink. I want to see if anything feels familiar. Inside, the restaurant was quiet between lunch and dinner service. A few elderly couples occupied corner tables, and a bartender polished glasses behind a small marble counter. We sat at the bar, ordering a glass of Chianti for me, apparently my usual, and a beer for Dean. The wine tasted rich and familiar on my tongue. I closed my eyes, letting the flavor fill my senses, searching for any memory connections. Nothing specific emerged, but the atmosphere felt right somehow. The soft murmur of conversation, the clink of glassware, the scent of garlic and tomatoes from the kitchen. You always ordered the same thing, Dean said, watching me. Linguine alla vongole. Said it reminded you of summers in Rhode Island with your grandmother. I opened my eyes. My grandmother taught me to dig for clams. We'd go out at low tide with buckets and little rakes. Finding none, he nodded slowly. What does that look like, practically speaking? Honesty? Space? Patience. I counted them off on my fingers. No more deleted messages or hidden truths. No pressure to feel things I don't feel yet. And time. Time to rebuild neural pathways, to create new memories, to see if what we had can be reconstructed, or if something different might grow in its place. And Ricardo? He asked, the name clearly difficult for him to say. Remains, A question I'll answer when I'm ready, I said firmly. Not out of spite or to keep you guessing, but because I genuinely don't know what I want regarding him. The connection is there in my brain scans, but I need to understand if it's real or just neural wiring preserved through trauma. Dean took a deep breath, released it slowly. Okay, we start over. No expectations, no pressure. Just two people figuring out if they have a future together. I offered my hand, and he took it hesitantly. My name is Elara Morgan, I said with a small smile. I used to be a linguistics professor. Now I'm just trying to find my way back to myself. A ghost of a smile touched his lips. Dean Morgan. I teach comparative literature and make a decent risotto, currently helping my wife navigate the strangest chapter of our lives. We sat there, hands clasped loosely, the evening light casting long shadows across the bedroom floor. Not quite strangers, not quite partners, but something in between. Two people standing at a crossroads, finally seeing all paths clearly. The next morning, I woke before dawn, the bedroom bathed in the blue-gray light of early morning. Dean had slept in the guest room again, a boundary we'd established as part of our starting over agreement. I laid in bed for a moment, cataloging my feelings. The anger from yesterday had faded, replaced by something like resolve. Today marked 1 week since I'd woken up speaking Portuguese. 1 week of navigating this strange new existence. I padded, downstairs in bare feet, making coffee in the quiet kitchen. Through the window, I could see our backyard, a Japanese maple just beginning to turn crimson, a small herb garden near the fence, a wooden bench beneath an arbor. Had I chosen these things? Had I sat on that bench with a book on summer evenings? My therapist, Dr. Abernathy, whom I'd met yesterday after my session with Dr. Winters, had suggested I create new memories deliberately to rebuild my connection to my environment. Think of it as constructing a bridge from who you are now to the life around you, she'd said. With that in mind, I took my coffee outside, wrapping myself in a cardigan against the autumn chill. The bench was cool beneath me, slightly damp, with morning dew. I ran my fingers over the smooth wood, noticing small imperfections, a knot in the grain, initials carved discreetly in one corner, DM plus EM, Dean and Elara Morgan. A small act of sentimentality that struck me as both touching and foreign. Had I watched him carve these? Had I protested or encouraged it? Morning, Dean's voice came from the back door. He stood there holding his own coffee mug, hesitant. Mind if I join you? I gestured to the space beside me. It's your bench, too. He sat, leaving a careful few inches between us. First time? You've sat out here since the accident. I'm trying to create new connections, I explained, Dr. Abernathy's suggestion. He nodded, blowing across his coffee. I built this bench, you know, our second anniversary. You'd been talking about wanting a reading nook in the garden. I studied the bench with new interest. You made this? It's beautiful work. I was better with my hands back then, he said, with a self-deprecating smile, before academia claimed all my time. Tell me about that, I said, turning slightly to face him. How we met. The real version, not the photo album highlights. Dean's expression softened with memory. Faculty. Orientation at Waverly. You were 3 years into your tenure track, already making waves in the linguistics department. I was the nervous new hire in comparative literature. You were wearing this green dress that matched your eyes, and when they asked us to pair up, for some ridiculous team-building exercise, you picked me. Why? I asked, genuinely curious. I asked you that months later. You said it was because I was the only one who didn't look like I was trying too hard to seem smart. He chuckled. Academic egos were on full display that day. I smiled, trying to picture the scene. And then? Coffee after the orientation. You talked about language acquisition patterns. I talked about symbolic resonance in translation. Complete academic gibberish to most people, but we kept finishing each other's sentences. His eyes grew distant with memory. You invited me to a department mixer the following week. I spent 3 days deciding what to wear. The image was charming. This confident man beside me fretting over clothing choices like a teenager. Fast forward to the proposal? Dean's smile faltered slightly. That wasn't as romantic as you might hope. We'd been dating about a year. We were at a conference in Montreal. You were presenting on bilingual cognition patterns. There was a terrible snowstorm. Our flight got canceled and we ended up stranded in this tiny hotel for 2 extra days. Sounds romantic to me, I offered. It wasn't, he laughed. The heating was spotty, we were living on vending machine snacks, and we both had piles of ungraded midterms. We were sitting on the bed surrounded by papers, both grading, neither of us had showered that day, and suddenly I just looked at you and thought, this is it. This is what I want forever. The messy, imperfect, real thing. So you proposed surrounded by student essays? With a paperclip, he confirmed. Bent it into a circle, went down on one knee right there on the hotel carpet, promised to get you a real ring when we got home. I glanced at my left hand, where a simple emerald sat in a gold band. This one? He nodded. You said you didn't want a diamond. That emeralds reminded you of growth, of living things. That sounded right. Somehow, a choice that resonated with who I felt I was, even now. Thank you, I said softly, for telling me that story, the real version. That's what we promised, right? Honesty. We sat in comfortable silence for a few minutes, watching the garden slowly brighten with daylight. Birds hopped along the fence, pecking at the ground for breakfast. I have cognitive therapy at 10, I said eventually. But after that, I'd like to go back to the university. Would you come with me? Show me our old haunts. Help me see it through your eyes. The surprise on his face quickly gave way to pleasure. I'd like that. 2 hours later, after a session with Dr. Abernathy that left me mentally exhausted but clearer, Dean and I walked across the Waverly campus. The quad was busy with students rushing between classes, lounging on blankets enjoying the mild weather, tossing frisbees despite signs prohibiting it. This is where we'd meet for lunch on Tuesdays and Thursdays, Dean said, pointing to a shaded bench near the old library. Our schedules overlapped, and it was halfway between our buildings. We continued walking, Dean occasionally pointing out landmarks of our shared history, the coffee shop where we'd grade papers on Sunday afternoons, the auditorium where I'd given a lecture that he said had made him fall in love with my mind. All over again, the oak tree where we'd shared our first kiss after a faculty reception. It felt like a guided tour of someone else's romance, but I found myself watching Dean more than the locations he indicated. The way his face lit up with certain memories, the gestures he used when excited, the sound of his laugh when recalling something particularly amusing. I was studying him, this man who knew me so well, looking for clues to who we had been together. And this, he said, stopping outside a small Italian restaurant just off campus, is where we had dinner the night you got back from Brazil, the first time. My attention sharpened. The first research trip? Before Ricardo? He nodded, his enthusiasm dimming slightly. You were different when you came back. Distracted. I thought it was just post-research adjustment, like your journal, said. But looking back, maybe that's when things started to change. I studied the restaurant, warm lighting visible through the windows, white tablecloths, a chalkboard outside listing specials in flowery script. Were we happy that night? Dean considered this, his brow furrowing with the effort of honest recollection. Parts of it. You were excited about your research, animated when talking about the linguistic patterns you'd discovered. But there was a distance, too. You wouldn't quite meet my eyes when I asked about the people you'd met. Let's go in, I said suddenly. Now? It's barely 4 o'clock. Just for a drink. I want to see if anything feels familiar. Inside, the restaurant was quiet between lunch and dinner service. A few elderly couples occupied corner tables, and a bartender polished glasses behind a small marble counter. We sat at the bar, ordering a glass of Chianti for me, apparently my usual, and a beer for Dean. The wine tasted rich and familiar on my tongue. I closed my eyes, letting the flavor fill my senses, searching for any memory connections. Nothing specific emerged, but the atmosphere felt right somehow. The soft murmur of conversation, the clink of glassware, the scent of garlic and tomatoes from the kitchen. "You always ordered the same thing," Dean said, watching me. "Linguini alla vongole. Said it reminded you of summers in Rhode Island with your grandmother." I opened my eyes. "My grandmother taught me to dig for clams. We'd go out at low tide with buckets and little rakes." The memory had surfaced without effort, complete with the sensation of wet sand between my toes and my grandmother's voice calling warnings about where to step. It wasn't an emotional memory, but it was clear, intact. "That's the first clear childhood memory I've had since waking up," I said, surprised. Dean smiled, genuinely pleased. "Dr. Winters said this might happen. Random memories returning without warning." "But why that one? Why now?" He shrugged. "Sensory triggers, maybe. The wine, the smell of the restaurant." I took another sip, wondering what other memories might be hiding, waiting for the right trigger to resurface. We finished our drinks in companionable silence, then walked back to campus as the afternoon light began to soften toward evening. Near the linguistics building, a woman called out to me. "Elara, oh my God, you're back." She hurried toward us, petite, dark-haired, perhaps in her early 40s. Her face was alight with recognition and relief. I glanced at Dean questioningly. "Maya Cho," he murmured. "Your research partner. Sociolinguistics." Maya reached us, slightly breathless. "I've been calling and texting. When they said coma, I was so worried, and then no one would tell me anything because I'm not family." She pulled me into a tight hug before I could respond. I returned the embrace awkwardly, catching Dean's eye over her shoulder. He nodded encouragingly. "I'm still recovering," I said as she released me. "Memory issues." Maya's expression shifted to concern. "Oh, Elara, I'm so sorry, that's awful." She glanced between Dean and me. "Do you remember me?" "Dean just reminded me," I admitted. "I'm having trouble with emotional connections to memories from before the accident." Her face fell slightly, but she recovered quickly. "Well, I'm just glad you're okay physically. The department has been in chaos without you. Your classes, your research grants." "Actually," Dean interjected gently, "Elara's on medical leave for the semester. She's focusing on recovery right now." Maya nodded quickly. Of course. I didn't mean to pressure you." She hesitated, then added, "I was just excited to see you. We were in the middle of something important before your accident." This caught my attention. "What project?" "The expanded São Paulo research," she said, as if it should be obvious. "The cognitive shift patterns in immigrant communities? You'd just secured the follow-up grant." I glanced at Dean, whose expression had gone carefully neutral. "I don't remember much about that work," I admitted. Maya looked disappointed but understanding. "Well, it's all documented. The research notes, interview transcripts, everything's in our shared cloud drive, whenever you're ready." She checked her watch. "I have to run to class, but please call me when you're up for it. So much to catch up on." With another quick hug, she hurried into the building. Dean and I stood in silence for a moment after she left. Finally, I turned to him. "You didn't mention I was working on a follow-up project to the Brazil research." "I didn't know the details," he said carefully. "Just that you'd received another grant." "You were less forthcoming about your work in the months before the accident." I studied his face, looking for signs of deception, but saw only weary honesty. I want to see those research files. Today. He nodded, resignation in his posture. I figured, you might. Back in my campus office, I logged into my university account, the password still somehow accessible to my procedural memory, and opened the shared drive Maya had mentioned. Dozens of folders appeared, meticulously organized by date and topic. I clicked on the most recent titled São Paulo Cognitive Shifts, Phase 2. Inside were hundreds of files, interview transcripts, audio recordings, data analyses, grant applications. I opened documents at random, scanning their contents. They detailed research on how immigrant communities experienced cognitive and emotional shifts when operating in their new language versus their native tongue. Fascinating work, thorough and insightful. But nothing about Ricardo. No personal notes, no hints of an emotional connection. Just pure academic research. This doesn't make sense, I murmured, more to myself than to Dean, who sat quietly in the corner of the office. According to my journal, Ricardo was central to this research, but there's no mention of him anywhere in these files. Maybe you kept your personal connection separate from the professional documentation, Dean suggested. I continued searching, opening folder after folder, until I found a subdirectory labeled simply Interview Set C, Subject R. Inside were audio files, all dated during my first trip to Brazil. With trembling fingers, I clicked on one. A man's voice filled the office, deep, accented, speaking in Portuguese. The same voice from the voicemail Dean had shown me. My own. Voice followed, asking questions about language usage patterns, emotional responses to certain phrases, memory formation in bilingual contexts. It was him, Ricardo. But in these recordings, he wasn't my lover or confidant. He was a research subject, one of dozens I had interviewed for my project. I listened to several recordings, searching for any hint of personal connection, any subtext in our exchanges. There was nothing beyond professional courtesy, perhaps a growing intellectual rapport, but nothing suggesting the passion described in my journal. I don't understand, I said, turning to Dean in confusion. These are from my first trip, before anything supposedly happened between us. But he sounds like just another interview subject. Dean moved closer, studying the screen over my shoulder. What was the timeline in your journal? When did things change between you? I thought back to the entries. Second trip, about 4 months after the first. I wrote that we'd kept in touch, between visits, that he'd shown me parts of São Paulo tourists never see during the first trip, but that things remained professional until I returned. And these interviews are all from the first trip? I checked the dates. Yes, all within the same 2-week period in January 2023. Dean hesitated, then said gently, Elara, is it possible that what you wrote in your journal wasn't entirely accurate? The question hung in the air between us. I stared at the screen, at the neatly organized files of a dedicated academic researcher. You think I made it up? The affair? The connection with Ricardo? Not necessarily made it up, he clarified quickly. But perhaps embellished? Psychologists talk about emotional affairs, connections that feel more significant in our minds than they are in reality. I shook my head, unwilling to accept this explanation. The voicemail was real. He was expecting me to fly to Brazil the day after my accident. That's not embellishment. True, Dean acknowledged, but it doesn't mean everything happened exactly as you described it to yourself. I turned back to the computer, opening more files, searching for any evidence that would confirm or refute the narrative I'd written in my journal. Nothing aligned perfectly. The research timeline matched, but the personal connection remained elusive in the official documentation. There's only one way to know for sure, I said finally. I need to talk to him. Dean tensed beside me, but didn't object. Are you sure that's wise, given your current cognitive state? I'm not the same person who wrote those journal entries, I reminded him. Whatever I felt then, I can approach this objectively now. I just need to understand what was real and what wasn't. He sighed deeply. What do you need from me? His willingness to help, despite how painful this must be for him, touched me unexpectedly. Just support and honesty, no matter what we discover. Dean nodded solemnly. You have both. I took a deep breath and dialed the number from the voicemail. My heart pounded as the international ringtone sounded once, twice, 3 times, then a click, and that familiar voice. Hello? Ricardo? I said, my voice steadier than I expected. This is Elara Morgan. A pause then. Elara? Meu Deus, is it really you? What happened? I waited at the airport for hours. I glanced at Dean, who had moved to the window, giving me privacy while remaining present. I was in an accident, I explained. The day I was supposed to fly to Brazil. I've been in a coma until recently. A coma? Ricardo's voice rose with concern. Are you all right? Why didn't anyone tell me? It's complicated, I said. Ricardo, I need to ask you something important, and I need you to be completely honest with me. Of course, he said immediately. Anything. I closed my eyes, centering myself. What exactly was our relationship? My memory has been affected by the accident, and I'm trying to piece things together. Another pause, longer this time. I don't understand. You don't remember us? I remember fragments, I explained. But I need to hear your perspective. Please, just tell me the truth. Ricardo sighed, a soft static through the phone line. We met during your first research trip. I was one of your interview subjects. My family emigrated from Portugal to Brazil 3 generations ago, making me ideal for your study on linguistic drift. We became friends. You were brilliant, passionate about your work. We stayed in touch after you returned to America. So far, this matched what I knew. And when I came back for the second trip? Things changed, he said simply. Not right away. We worked together for weeks, expanding your research. But there was a connection between us that went beyond academic interest. One night, after a particularly intense interview session about emotional language processing, you told me you felt more alive speaking Portuguese with me than English with your husband. Dean's back stiffened at the window, though he didn't turn around. And then? I prompted. We didn't plan it, Ricardo continued. But that night, something shifted. We talked until dawn about language and identity, about how different you felt in Portuguese versus English. You said it was like accessing another version of yourself, more authentic, less constrained. When I kissed you, you said it felt like finally being seen. The words resonated somewhere deep within me, not as memory but as truth. I had felt that way speaking Portuguese in the hospital, like accessing a self that existed beneath layers of acquired identity. What happened after I went back to Connecticut? We talked every day, he said. Late at night for you, early, morning for me. You were torn. Your life in America felt increasingly like a performance, you said, but you had commitments, a career, a marriage. I never pushed you to leave. That decision was yours. But eventually I decided to come to you, I said. Yes, he confirmed. 3 months ago, you called saying you couldn't live divided anymore. We made plans. You would come for a research trip first, to be sure, then return to settle your affairs if it felt right. And the final decision? To leave permanently? That came the week before your flight. You called at midnight your time, said you'd written a letter to your husband, that you were ready for a new beginning. His voice softened. I asked if you were sure. You said you'd never been more certain of anything. I thanked him, promised to call again when I'd processed everything, and hung up. The office felt too small suddenly, the air too thick. Dean remained at the window, his posture rigid with pain he was trying to hide. "You heard?" I asked quietly. He nodded without turning. "Enough." I moved to stand beside him, looking out at the campus where we'd met, fallen in love, built a life together. "It matches my journal entries," I said, "but something still feels off. Not the relationship with Ricardo. That rings true, but something else." Dean finally turned to me, his expression carefully composed. "What?" "The timing," I said slowly, thinking it through. According to both my journal and Ricardo, I made the final decision to leave just days before the accident, after months of uncertainty. Isn't that a strange coincidence? A shadow crossed Dean's face. "What are you suggesting?" "I don't know," I admitted, "but it feels important somehow. Like the universe intervened at precisely the moment I'd made. My choice." I shook my head, frustrated by the lingering sense that a crucial piece was still missing. "We should go home. I need to think." The drive back was silent, each of us lost in our thoughts. The sun was setting as we pulled into our driveway, painting the sky in dramatic oranges and purples. Inside, Dean went straight to his study, murmuring something about papers to grade. I understood his need for space after what he'd heard. Alone. In the kitchen, I made tea, the routine actions soothing my racing mind. As the kettle boiled, I stared out the window at our darkening backyard. The bench where we'd sat that morning seemed to belong to different people now. Simpler people with uncomplicated histories. I carried my tea upstairs, drawn to the bedroom, more by instinct than conscious decision. Sitting on the edge of the bed, I surveyed the room that should have felt like mine, but still didn't quite fit. The nightstand held a small stack of books, linguistic texts, a novel in French, a book of poetry. I picked up the poetry volume, opening to a random page. A small photograph fell out, worn at the edges, clearly handled often. I picked it up, expecting another wedding picture or family snapshot. Instead, I found myself looking at a coastline, rocky shores, blue water, a lighthouse in the distance. Written on the back in my handwriting, "Maine, where I found myself. September 2021. Maine, where Dean had proposed during that snowstorm. I flipped through the poetry book, finding more photographs tucked between pages, all landscapes, all annotated with similar cryptic messages about identity and self-discovery. None included people, just places, a mountain trail, a desert vista, a city skyline at dusk. These didn't fit the narrative I'd been constructing, of a woman trapped in a stifling marriage, finding liberation through connection with another man. These were the mementos of someone actively seeking self-understanding through solitude and reflection. I set the book aside, increasingly unsettled by these contradictory versions of myself. The woman who wrote passionate journal entries about Ricardo, who planned to abandon her life for him, seemed at odds with the woman who tucked landscapes into poetry books and wrote about finding herself in Maine. As I prepared for bed, these thoughts continued to circle. Which version was real? The academic who fell for her research subject and discovered her true self in a foreign language? Or the introspective soul who found meaning in solitary landscapes and poetry? Or neither? Just fragments of a complex person I might never fully recover. I lay awake long after the house grew quiet, staring at the ceiling, searching for answers in the shadows. Just before sleep finally claimed me, a thought surfaced from the depths. What if the coma hadn't taken my memories, but revealed a truth I'd been hiding from myself all along? Dreams pulled me under that night, more vivid than any since waking from the coma. Not fragments of memory, but something deeper. Oceans of blue-green water, words floating on the surface like leaves, and beneath it all, a sense of falling that didn't feel like terror, but like surrender. When my eyes opened at 4:17 a.m., I knew what I needed to do. I dressed quietly in the dark, wrote a note for Dean, and slipped out to my car. The highways were nearly empty as I drove north, headlights cutting through pre-dawn darkness. By the time the sun rose, painting the sky in watercolor washes of pink and gold, I was crossing the state line into Maine. I hadn't planned this journey consciously, but some deeper part of me had been navigating all along. When I reached the coastal town of Camden, I pulled into a scenic overlook and cut the engine. Below me, the harbor was coming to life. Fishing boats heading out to sea, early risers walking dogs along the shoreline, shopkeepers raising awnings over storefronts. This place. This was the coastline from the photograph in my poetry book. I sat on the hood of my car, watching the town awaken, feeling something shift inside me. Not memory exactly, but recognition. I belonged here, had found some essential truth in this place. The photograph's inscription echoed in my mind. Maine, where I found myself. After an hour of simply absorbing the view, I drove into town. A small coffee shop called Harbor Light was just opening its doors. Inside, the scent of fresh coffee and baking pastries wrapped around me like a familiar embrace. Without thinking, I ordered a cardamom latte and blueberry scone, then chose a table by the window overlooking the water. Professor Morgan? A woman in her 60s approached my table, silver hair cut in a stylish bob, eyes bright with recognition. "I thought that was you? It's been months." I smiled apologetically. "I'm sorry, I've had an accident. My memory isn't what it should be." Her face softened with concern. "Oh dear, I didn't know. I'm Margaret Ellison. I own the bookshop next door. You stayed in my rental cottage last fall during your sabbatical." Sabbatical. The word triggered something. Not a complete memory, but awareness of a gap in the narrative I'd been piecing together. "I took a sabbatical?" I asked. Margaret nodded, sliding into the chair across from me. 3 months, September through November last year. You were writing a book, you said. Something about language and identity. She smiled warmly. You? We're here nearly every morning, same order, same table. Started calling you Cardamom after a while. Would you tell me more? I asked. About my time here? Margaret studied me for a moment, seeming to gauge how serious my memory issues were. You were searching for something. Not in a frantic way, but methodically, deliberately. You hiked every trail along the coast, sat for hours watching. The water. You filled notebooks. I remember because you kept buying new ones from my shop. Was I alone? Completely, she confirmed. That struck me. Most academics on sabbatical bring family, at least for part of the time. But you were adamant about solitude, said you needed to hear your own thoughts without interference. I digested this information, trying to reconcile it with what I knew, or thought I knew, about myself. The cottage where I stayed, is it available now? Margaret's eyebrows rose slightly. As a matter of fact, it is. Between renters until next week. She hesitated. Are you planning to stay? Just a day or two, I said. I think I left something important there. Not physically, but I struggled to articulate what I meant. A piece of yourself, Margaret finished, understanding in her eyes. The cottage key is at the bookshop. I'll get it for you after you finish your breakfast. No charge. It's sitting empty anyway. An hour later, I drove down a narrow lane lined with pine trees, following Margaret's directions to the cottage. It sat on a small bluff overlooking the bay, a compact structure of weathered cedar shingles and white trim, with a wraparound porch and large windows facing the water. The key turned easily in the lock. Inside, the cottage was exactly as Margaret had described. Open floor plan, comfortable but not luxurious furniture, bookshelves built into every available wall. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, a writing desk positioned nearby to catch the best light. I moved through the space slowly, running my fingers over surfaces, opening drawers, looking for anything that might trigger recognition. The cottage had been cleaned between renters, all personal items removed, yet it felt undeniably familiar, not in specifics, but in essence. At the desk, I sat in the wooden chair, placing my hands flat on the surface. Had I written my journal entries about Ricardo here? Planned my escape from my marriage in this peaceful space? Somehow, that narrative felt increasingly discordant with this environment. I opened the desk drawers, finding them empty except for a few pens and paper clips. But when I pulled the middle drawer all the way out, I noticed something caught in the back. A small blue notebook wedged against the frame. I worked it free carefully. The cover was plain, no name or title. Inside, my handwriting filled page after page. Not the neat, controlled script of my research notes or even the passionate flow of my personal journal, but something raw, almost urgent. I began to read. September 14th, 2023. I'm fracturing. There's no other word for it. Elara the professor, Elara the wife, Elara the researcher, Elara the lover, all these versions competing for dominance, none of them feeling entirely real. Which is the authentic self? Is there such a thing? Or are we just collections of roles we play for different audiences? September 17th, 2023. Dean called today, said he misses me, asked when I'm coming home. I couldn't answer honestly because I don't know where home is anymore. The cottage feels more real than our house in Connecticut, yet it's just a temporary shelter. Ricardo texted later, said he's thinking of me. 2 men, 2 versions of myself, neither complete. September 23rd, 2023. Walked the shoreline for hours today. The rhythm of waves against rock has become a meditation. With each step, I asked myself, who are you when no one is watching? When no role needs performing? The answer came not in words, but in sensation. The weight of my body against stone, the taste of salt on my lips, the sound of my own breathing beneath the crash of waves. I am this, just this, present, alive. Everything else is construction. I turned pages with increasing urgency, reading entries that documented not a woman in love with Ricardo, but a woman in existential crisis, questioning her marriage, yes, but also her career, her identity, her every choice. Ricardo appeared, not as a salvation, but as another role she was trying on, another potential self she was testing. October 5th, 2023. The dreams have started again. Portuguese flows through them like water, carrying me to places I've never physically been. Ricardo is there sometimes, but not as himself, more as a symbol of possibility, of the self I might become if I shed everything familiar. Is that love, or just escapism dressed in romantic clothing? October 12th, 2023. Dean deserves better than half of me. Ricardo deserves more than a fantasy projection. And I deserve to stop hiding from the truth. I've been using them both to avoid facing myself. The real question isn't which man to choose, but which Elara to become. October 31st, 2023. Halloween. The Day of Masks seems fitting. I've decided to return to Connecticut next week, to resume my role as Professor Morgan, wife of Dean. Not because it's right, but because I need to determine once and for all if it's wrong. No more dividing myself between continents, between languages, between lives. I will be fully present in my marriage, my work, my English-speaking self. And if that self suffocates, then I'll know it's time to leave, not for Ricardo, but for me. The entries continued through November, documenting my return to Connecticut, my attempts to fully inhabit my marriage, my growing certainty that something fundamental needed to change. The final entry was dated February 28th, 2024, just days before my accident. I've made my decision. Not in haste or passion, but with complete clarity. This life I've built no longer fits the person I've become. Dean is a good man who deserves a whole partner. not someone playing a role. Ricardo represents possibility, but I won't leap from one identity to another without understanding who I am alone first. I'll go to Brazil, yes, not to fall into Ricardo's arms, but to explore this self that emerges in Portuguese, that thinks and feels differently than my English self. Maybe I'll stay, maybe I'll go elsewhere after, but I can't stay here pretending anymore. The letter is written. Tomorrow, I leave. I close the notebook, my hands trembling. This account differed significantly from my journal at home. Less about passionate love for Ricardo, more about a profound identity crisis. This Elara wasn't running toward a lover, but away from a life that had become inauthentic. Ricardo was part of the journey, but not its destination. And yet, both accounts ended with the same decision. To leave Dean, to fly to Brazil, to begin again. The letter in our safe suddenly made more sense, not a confession of affair-driven abandonment, but a more complex acknowledgement that our marriage had become a performance I could no longer sustain. I sat at the desk until evening, reading and rereading the hidden notebook, trying to reconcile these different narratives. As darkness fell, I built a fire in the stone hearth, made tea in the small kitchen, and curled up on the sofa with a blanket I found in the bedroom closet. My phone buzzed, a text from Dean. "Everything okay? Your note just said you needed space to think." I replied simply, "I'm in Maine. Found something important. We'll explain when I return tomorrow." Then I set the phone aside and stared into the flames, letting the contradiction of my two journals wash over me. Which was real? The passionate account of falling for Ricardo, or this more reflective exploration of identity crisis? Perhaps both contained elements of truth, filtered through different aspects of myself. I slept on the sofa, wrapped in the blanket, the fire burning down to embers. My dreams were filled with water again, not drowning but floating, suspended between worlds, between languages, between selves. Morning brought clarity with the sunrise. I walked the shoreline path Margaret had mentioned, the same one I'd apparently walked daily during my sabbatical. The rhythmic crash of waves against rock created a meditation, just as my notebook had described. With each step, I felt more centered, more connected to some essential truth. By the time I returned to the cottage to shower and pack, I knew what I needed to do. I drove back to Connecticut with both journals on the passenger seat beside me, the hidden notebook from Maine and the personal journal from home that I'd brought along to compare. Two versions of myself, two narratives that needed reconciliation. Dean was waiting when I arrived home late that afternoon. He sat at the kitchen table, hands wrapped around a mug of cold coffee, looking like he hadn't slept. Relief washed over his face when I walked in, quickly followed by wariness. "You found something in Maine," he said. Not a question. I nodded, placing both journals on the table. Another perspective, another piece of the puzzle. I explained about the cottage, about Margaret, about finding the hidden notebook. As I spoke, Dean's expression shifted from tense anticipation to something more complex, sadness tinged with understanding. "You weren't just having an affair," he said when I finished. "You were having an identity crisis." "It seems that way," I agreed. I wasn't running to Ricardo as much as I was running from a life that no longer fit who I was becoming. Dean picked up the main notebook, turning it over in his hands, but not opening it. "And now? The person you are after the accident. What does she want?" The question hung between us, vital and unavoidable. I considered it carefully before answering. "She wants to stop running," I said finally. "Stop hiding, stop performing roles. Wife, professor, lover, victim. She wants to integrate all these fragmented selves into something whole." "And where do I fit in that process?" Dean asked, his voice steady despite the cost I could see in his eyes. "I don't know yet," I admitted. "But I'd like to find out, honestly, openly, without either of us pretending to be someone we're not." He nodded slowly. I can work with that. The next morning, I had another appointment with Dr. Winters for brain imaging. This time, Dean didn't accompany me, giving me space to process my discoveries independently. As I lay in the MRI machine, Dr. Winters guided me through different memory exercises than before. Think about your time in Maine last fall. Her voice came through the speaker. Any specific moment that feels important. I closed my eyes, remembering the shoreline path, the rhythm of waves, the sensation of solidity beneath my feet. Unlike previous memory attempts, this one carried emotional weight. Not happiness exactly, but certainty, groundedness, peace. After the scan, Dr. Winters showed me the results, her excitement barely contained beneath her professional demeanor. "This is remarkable," she said, pointing to colorful areas of my brain scan. "When accessing memories of Maine, your limbic system engages fully, similar to how it responded to thoughts of Ricardo before, but with different regions activated. These areas," she indicated sections lit up in yellow and orange, "are associated with self-recognition and integrated identity." "What does that mean in practical terms?" I asked. She leaned back in her chair. "It suggests that during your time in Maine, you were experiencing a state of integrated selfhood. The regions of your brain responsible for different aspects of identity were communicating effectively. That's rare after trauma like yours, where identity often fragments." "So, Maine represents wholeness," I suggested. "In a neurological sense, yes," she confirmed. "These patterns indicate a more cohesive sense of self than we've seen in your other memory tests." I left the hospital with a strange sense of lightness. The contradiction between my journals suddenly seemed less important than what they represented. Together, a woman struggling toward authenticity, using both Ricardo and solitude as paths toward self-understanding. Instead of going home, I drove to the university and went directly to Maya Cho's office. She looked up in surprise when I knocked on her open door. "Elara, I didn't expect to see you on campus." She gestured to the chair across from her desk. "How are you feeling?" "Better," I said, sitting down. "Clearer. I need to ask you something important, Maya. Something about my research." She straightened, suddenly attentive. "Of course. Anything." The cognitive shift patterns we were studying in Brazilian immigrants, was I incorporating any of that research into a book about identity formation? Maya's eyes widened slightly. "Yes, absolutely. That was the whole point of your sabbatical, last fall. You were expanding the research into a broader theory about language and selfhood, how operating in different languages creates distinct cognitive frameworks, essentially different versions of the self." "And Ricardo," I said carefully, "the subject from my interviews. Did I ever mention him to you in a personal context?" She hesitated, clearly weighing her words. "You said he was a particularly insightful subject, that his experience of shifting between Portuguese and English mirrored something you were experiencing yourself." She paused. "Elara, is this about the emails?" My pulse quickened. "What emails?" "The ones you sent me from Maine, about your identity crisis, about feeling like a different person in Portuguese versus English." She studied my face. "You really don't remember?" "Show me," I said. "Please." Maya turned to her computer, typing rapidly. "You asked me not to mention them to anyone. Said you were working through something personal that was informing your research." She clicked a few more times, then turned the screen toward me. "Here, our entire exchange from last fall." Leaned forward, scanning emails between Maya and myself. Dozens of messages discussing identity theory, linguistic frameworks, and my own experience of cognitive shifting between languages. In these exchanges, I openly discussed my confusion about my marriage, my connection with Ricardo, my sabbatical journey toward integration. "You were developing a revolutionary theory," Maya said softly, "that bilingual individuals don't just switch languages, they switch selves. that each language constructs a distinct cognitive framework, a different way of perceiving and processing reality. And I was experiencing it myself, I murmured, reading my own words on the screen. Maya nodded. You said your Portuguese self felt more authentic, more aligned with who you were becoming, while your English self felt increasingly like a performance of the person you had been. Did I mention leaving Dean, going to Brazil permanently? Her expression grew troubled. In your last email, yes. You said you needed to fully inhabit your Portuguese self to understand if it was truly more authentic or just an escape from problems you weren't facing. She hesitated. I advised against making permanent decisions while in the midst of such exploration. You agreed to approach it as a research trip first, to test your theory in real conditions. I sat back, absorbing this new information. My plan to leave hadn't been a simple escape into a passionate affair, but a complex experiment in identity. A researcher testing her own theory about language and selfhood. Maya, did anything unusual happen in the department the day of my accident? Did I seem different that morning? She thought for a moment. You canceled your afternoon class, which wasn't like you. And you came to my office to leave a copy of your manuscript. Said it was a backup, just in case. Do you still have it? Of course. She opened a drawer, pulled out a thick manila envelope sealed with tape. My name was written across the front in my handwriting, along with the words, "Hold for safekeeping." With trembling hands, I accepted the envelope. May I? Maya nodded, and I carefully broke the seal. Inside was a manuscript titled, The Multilingual Self, Language as Identity Framework. I flipped through the pages, finding a complete academic work interwoven with personal narrative. My experiences in Brazil and Maine used as case studies in identity formation through language acquisition. The final chapter was titled Integration, Beyond Either Or. I read the opening paragraph. The question is not which self is more authentic, the English-speaking academic or the Portuguese-speaking explorer, but how to integrate these seemingly disparate selves into a cohesive whole. Language creates cognitive frameworks through which we process reality, but the integrated self exists beyond any single framework, capable of moving fluidly between worlds without losing core continuity. I closed the manuscript, a strange calm settling over me. I was never running away, I said, more to myself than to Maya. I was running toward integration. That was your theory, she agreed. That true selfhood isn't found in a single language or culture, but in the conscious integration of multiple frameworks. I thanked Maya, promising to talk more when I was ready to return to work, and left with the manuscript tucked under my arm. In my car, I sat for a long moment, letting everything settle, the journal from home focusing on Ricardo, the notebook from Maine exploring identity crisis, and now this manuscript merging personal journey with academic theory. The picture was becoming clear. I hadn't been a woman torn between two men, but a researcher experiencing her own theory firsthand, discovering how language shapes identity, creates distinct selves that can feel mutually exclusive until integrated. The accident hadn't stolen my identity. It had thrown these disparate selves into sharp relief. Waking up speaking Portuguese wasn't just a neurological quirk, but a physical manifestation of the integration I'd been seeking. My Portuguese self pushing through when my conscious control was suspended. I drove home slowly, the manuscript beside me, my mind finally quieting after weeks of fragmentation and confusion. Dean was in the garden when I arrived, kneeling beside a flower bed, hands deep in soil. He looked up as I approached, shielding, his eyes against the late afternoon sun. You found something else, he said, noting the manuscript in my hands. I nodded, sitting on the bench, our bench, and waited for him to join me. When he did, I placed the manuscript between us. I wasn't having an affair in the conventional sense, I began. I was conducting research on myself, on identity formation through language, Ricardo was part of that, yes, but not in the way I described in my journal. What way, then? Dean asked, his voice carefully neutral. He represented a possibility, a version of myself that emerged in Portuguese, that thought and felt differently than my English self. I tapped the manuscript. I was developing a theory about multilingual identity, using my own experience as a case study. Dean was silent for a long moment, absorbing this. And the decision to leave? To go to Brazil? Was part of the research, I said. A test of whether my Portuguese self was truly more authentic or just an escape from challenges I wasn't facing here. According to Maya, I had agreed to approach it as a temporary research trip, not a permanent move. But the letter in our safe was written during a moment of clarity about our marriage, I acknowledged. That part was real. I did feel I was performing a role with you, that something fundamental had shifted. But I wasn't leaving for Ricardo as much as for myself, to understand who I was becoming. Dean picked up the manuscript, turning it over, in his hands. And now, after everything, the accident, the coma, waking up speaking Portuguese, who are you becoming now? I reached for his hand, covering it with mine. Someone who wants integration, not division. Not Elara the wife or Elara the researcher or Elara the Portuguese speaker. Just Elara, all of it, whole and present. And is there room for me in that integrated self? He asked, the question hanging between us like a held breath. I think so, I said honestly. But not as we were, performing roles, keeping parts of ourselves hidden. Only if we both show up authentically, day after day, choosing each other with open eyes. He nodded slowly, understanding in his gaze. I can work with that. As the sun set behind the Japanese maple, casting long shadows across the garden, I felt something shift inside me. Not memory returning, but something deeper. Integration. The English-speaking professor and the Portuguese-speaking explorer merging into a single consciousness, neither dominant, both essential. I leaned against Dean's shoulder, not from obligation or habit, but from choice. The choice to be present, to be honest, to be whole. Te amo, I whispered, the Portuguese flowing naturally now. I love you. Both are true. He wrapped an arm around me, and we sat watching darkness settle over our garden. Not the perfect ending to a fairy tale, but the honest beginning of something real. A life built not on performing roles or escaping them, but on the courage to integrate all our fragmented selves into something beautiful and whole. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.